It's very wonderful to see a mountain and to want to climb it and put your flag on top of it. It is very wonderful to want to create your own mountain so that you can then climb it and put your flag on top of it. But it is also wonderful to know why you are doing that or why you are compelled to climb mountains in the first place. And you might discover that everyone values mountains, but you actually love the sea, and perhaps swimming is what you really should be doing. And if your calling is the mountain, then by all means go and climb the mountain. But if you have questions about the sea, you might as well run the experiment and see what happens. Life means to evolve, and if you're not evolving through small, incremental changes that build up over time to create a large change, then you're probably dead, and that shouldn't really be a goal of anyone. Like, I think every day I get up and I say, what are my priorities? And then I move towards that, and sometimes, honestly, my priorities are to see how many back-to-back episodes of whatever I'm watching on Netflix I can watch, if it's that kind of introverts, Sunday that I need, in order to be my best self out in the world, Monday morning. And sometimes it's, how much of my to-do list can I crank through before lunch? And so I tell myself that this to-do list or the things that are on it are so insignificant compared to the things that I have already done, or I've already survived, or already accomplished. That it's almost laughable that they think they can stay there on my to-do list, like they're actively mocking me. And so if you can get to the point where you can say, well, I've already pushed through something uncomfortable, or I've already done something that I didn't think that I was able to do, didn't have the skills to do, didn't have the confidence to even try. But yet circumstances intervened and I was forced to. I've already done these things. And yeah, they were in a different context, maybe they were in a personal context and not a career context, or in my case, they were in the theater and not in the science world, but it's proof of concept is already there. So what reason do I have to believe that it's not going to work again? So not thinking about it as this entirely novel new thing, because you do get the fear response to new things, because that's our brain trying to protect us from, things that might be dangerous, that we don't know anything about, and realizing that, in fact, this is a familiar task that's cloaked in a new environment. And so I think that there's a lot to be said for looking back at our successes and not just appreciating them, but really recognizing that the new challenges, in fact, are old dragons we've already slain. 8 out of the early accomplishments that I have made were because I didn't realize that there was an option, and there's actually a type of method for teaching. I also used to play the violin, and I was taught with the Suzuki method. And if you look up the Suzuki method, you have all of these little 4 or 5, 6-year-olds that are playing violin concertos that are, far beyond what you would think somebody of that age should be able to do, and it's because nobody told them that they shouldn't be able to do that. And so that was basically my reality. I was told, well, you're 11, you're gonna start going to college. So I went, and the expectation was, you're supposed to get good grades, so I did. Every time there was a goal put in front of me, I didn't realize you could not accomplish it, so I just did. We'll never really know who we would have been if we had made one different decision, way back there in our childhood, but because of the way the brain develops, we are more emotionally susceptible to the experiences that we have early on in life than we are later in life. We all have to live in this society that's been created for us, and there's, certain expectations that one is a contributing member of the community of humanity, and that can be accomplished in many different ways. I think if I had a group of young people that I was responsible for, I would try and listen more than maybe my parents did to what each of them want. I certainly wouldn't try and mentor all of them, because you can't do that, right? But put them in situations where they can find people to emulate and to look up to, and to ask the right questions because the worst thing in the world is to have an inquisitive mind, or to have questions and to not know the right people or have the right resources to get them answered. So the youthful brain is still plastic. It's still developing, and it's more susceptible to information in certain ways than in others. I'd use stories. I would use imaginative language and humor, but there's a certain amount of finishing that happens in those last few years in the early 20s, which is the full development of the prefrontal cortex, which is sort of responsible for those. our ability to think logical ZA to predict outcomes, and also maybe a little bit for us to project the negative outcomes as well, right? So optimism follows victim to reality. Brains are lazy because most of nature is lazy. There has to be a justifiable reason for our energy output, because that's using resources that are important for our survival. So if our brains are lazy and they follow the processes that are easiest for them to follow, if you have constantly trained your brain and through reframing and reframing that the positive, the optimistic outcome is the easiest one to think about, and it has to work very hard to think about the negative ones. Unless it's feeling threatened in some way, it will go, it seems good enough because it's a prediction machine. It's like I predict that this is probably what's going to happen. It'll be a positive outcome. There might be other factors, but the energy that I would be expending thinking about those other factors doesn't seem in line with what's necessary for the importance of this decision. So good enough. Our brains really don't like to be bored. They get very unhappy if they're understimulated, and then that can go to solving the problem in many different ways. Not just how can I solve the problem short term, but how can I ensure that this is not going to be a problem in the long run? Emotion was not useful, or it is actively a destructive thing in that I had to build my life entirely logically. Now that's obviously we're human, so it's impossible. We make emotional decisions all of the time. But a youthful developing brain thinks that this is something that can be done and that they can, always do the right thing. And the right thing is the logical thing. And then as I started to learn about the brain and as I started to learn about myself, I realized that I didn't have a lot of experience in seeing what would happen if just let them come. And most people experiment with this in adolescence, but they don't know they're experiencing, just these emotions. They just kind of think this is how I am and this is who I am, right? They don't think about it in an abstract way. I went to New York and I trained at the Alvin Ailey School, which is a very well-known school of modern dance. There in Manhattan, and I was gonna be a dancer, but then there were sort of cracks in the facade a little bit. I wasn't quite fulfilled. And when you're a dancer, especially when you're a young dancer, you're treated as if you don't have a mind of your own, and you are simply a body, and the artistic director and the choreographer or the teacher is giving you the input, and you have to give it back. And for someone that already had a bachelor's degree in biochemistry, that wasn't really satisfying, especially when they would make comments about biochemistry, like don't eat too much turkey for Thanksgiving because then you'll fall asleep because tryptophan. I'd be like, do you know how many turkeys you'd have to eat? But I digress. All I hope for women in STEM is that they stop worrying about whether or not they're fitting in and whether or not they are supposed to be emulating the men or making a point of being female, and they start just taking their power, taking their place at the table and not asking permission for it. And we have all of these trailblazing women that have had to do that. They have had to take, and there are so many glass ceilings in academia, the ancient ivory tower that it is, and they are still there to be broken. But I think for the masses, since we're always trying to get women in STEM now and women in coding, and so I think of it as hope this isn't offensive, like storming the beaches at Normandy. We just put enough women into the pipeline, and the fact that it's so leaky won't be a problem. We'll eventually get enough of them through to tenure track positions that there will start to be a positive feedback loop. And think that for the masses, it can be very difficult to be at your best when you're constantly looking over your shoulder and wondering if being you is enough.